This is Tempest Tossed, Conversations on Migration and Mobility, and I'm Alex Alenikoff.
My view is that it's pretty clear that at least for some asylum seekers, not for everyone, but at least for some asylum seekers, the U.S. is no longer safe for refugees.
I want you to put yourself in the shoes of an asylum seeker. You're facing violence, conflict in your home country, and you've reached the difficult decision that it's time to leave. So you travel first in your home state, and then you cross an international border to a neighboring state. In the refugee field, we call this the country of first asylum. That country gives you safety, maybe some emergency provisions. Perhaps you have family there or people from your home community. But after some period of time, it could be a week, a month, a year, it becomes clear to you that the country of first asylum is not the place to start to rebuild your life. Maybe the authorities there are not friendly to asylum claims from people from your home country or to people like you. Or maybe you face better economic prospects elsewhere, or you have family in another country who can help you get started. So you travel to another country, and there you request political asylum. So the authorities of that country might say to you, well, why didn't you seek asylum in the country you first traveled through? Weren't you safe there? And your answer might be, I don't think I could have gotten a fair hearing there, or they don't permit asylum seekers or refugees to work in that country. Under international law, there's no rule that says an asylum seeker has to apply for asylum in the first country he or she arrives in. And no second country, let's call it country B, has a right to return a person to that first country, let's call it country A, unless that country B can show that you were actually granted asylum in country A or had some other formal legal status in country A that ensures that you won't be sent home where you might face persecution. So what can country B do? It can't force country A to take you back, but it can enter into an agreement with country A that says if an asylum seeker comes to one of our countries first and then travels to the other, the first country agrees to take the asylum seeker back and adjudicate the claim. Now, the EU has had this kind of deal among its member states for many years, which actually broke down after the mass flow from Syria in 2015. And it then entered into an agreement with Turkey, under which Turkey will accept back Syrians who travel from Turkey to Greece. Actually, not many Syrians have been returned under that agreement, and some of the cases are currently pending in court. What is less known is that for the past 15 years, the United States has had this kind of deal with Canada. Under the so-called Safe Third Country Agreement, the number of asylum seekers entering Canada from the United States has dropped. And in recent years, hundreds of asylum seekers who began in the United States and traveled to Canada have been returned to the United States. The agreement looks increasingly problematic because U.S. asylum policies have tightened considerably under the Trump administration. The question then is the United States a safe third country, a country to which asylum seekers from Canada should be returned? With us today is Sean Rehaag, professor at Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto, an expert on Canadian and international refugee and immigration law. Sean, thanks so much for being with us today.
Hello.
Why don't we start by you telling us a bit how this Safe Third Country Agreement came into being? What was the purpose and the original scope of the agreement?
Yeah, well, from a Canadian perspective, the purpose of the agreement was essentially to reduce the number of asylum seekers coming to the country, because previously thousands of asylum seekers would come every year to Canada via the United States, and only a couple of hundred would go in the other direction. So Canada, looking at the experience in the European Union, was very keen on entering into an agreement that would let Canada send asylum seekers back to the United States. The United States, though, had long refused to enter into such an agreement. And then 9/11 happened. The United States became preoccupied with border security. And Canada made an offer to enact various common border security measures that the United States was seeking, and in exchange asked the United States to enter into the Safe Third Country Agreement. So that happened in about 2002, and the agreement came into effect in 2004.
And what was the effect of the agreement?
Well, the effect was an immediate drop in the number of asylum seekers coming to Canada, a drop by about a third. Although there were still some people who were coming across the Canada-U.S. border because there are some exceptions built into the agreement, it essentially dramatically reduced the number of people coming in.
As I understand it, the agreement only applies to people who present themselves at an official border crossing point, but not in between official border crossing points. Is that right?
That's right. So it only applies at official ports of entry, in fact, only official land ports of entry. If people, let's say, fly to the country, it doesn't apply. And if people cross the border irregularly between ports of entry, they'll be allowed to make their refugee claim in Canada.
So why didn't the agreement simply lead to many more people crossing illegally so they could apply for asylum and not be returned to the U.S.?
Yeah, well, advocates for refugees, when the agreement was first put forward, warned that the agreement would likely provide incentives for people to cross the border irregularly. And so there was a worry from the outset that this would happen. What we're seeing now, though, is because of pressures in the United States, and specifically because of tightening immigration and refugee policies, a larger number of asylum seekers are trying to get to Canada from the United States. So there's increased pressure. And because they can't come through the regular ports of entry, what's happening is large numbers, thousands, since the Trump administration took power, thousands have been crossing irregularly. It's important to know that when asylum seekers cross the border irregularly, they're not trying to sneak into the country. They're not trying to come in undetected. What's actually happening is they're just trying to come to places where it's convenient to cross between ports of entry, and they immediately seek out Canadian authorities in order to make a refugee claim. So one of the really fascinating parts of this whole story about the Safe Third Country Agreement is that there are these sites on the Canada-U.S. border that have become, de facto unofficial border crossings. They have infrastructure. There's Canadian Border Service Agency officials and RCMP officials.
RCMP is
the Canadian Police. Yes. So there's all this infrastructure. It looks very similar to an official port of entry, but because it's an unofficial port of entry, the Safe Third Country Agreement doesn't apply.
So why would any asylum seeker who thinks they'll get a better deal in Canada then present themselves at an official port of entry rather than at one of these unofficial ports of entry?
That's right. So relatively few asylum seekers are now coming to the official ports of entry unless they benefit from one of the exceptions to the Safe Third Country Agreement. Thousands are instead coming to these unofficial ports of entry. The agreement still may be having somewhat of a deterrent effect. So if you come to one of these official ports of entry, there'll be big signs up saying, don't cross here, you can't cross here, it's illegal to cross here. Sometimes there will be RCMP police officers kind of sternly warning, don't cross, you'll be arrested.
This is at the informal
This is at the informal ports. So there may be people who would be discouraged from crossing in those circumstances who might come to the official ports of entry, but it has become widely known in various communities that it is now possible to cross the border at these unofficial sites.
And many of the people crossing from the U.S. Have been Haitians who were in the United States and protected under temporary protected status, which the Trump administration has announced it is ending for Haitians. And they've now been coming to Canada to seek asylum there because they think they have a better chance in Canada than the U.S. Is that right? That
was the first large group of asylum seekers that came across unofficially were from the Haitian community. I mean, there are people from virtually every country in the world that are using this means to get to Canada, but Haitians were the first very large group. More recently, there's been a large group of of Nigerian asylum seekers. For that community, it's not about kind of a loss of a temporary status in the United States. It appears that it's mostly people who are getting visitor visas to the United States and then are going directly to the Canadian border and claiming refugee protection.
So even if there are many people coming to these so-called irregular ports of entry, still many are presenting themselves at ports of entry, and they're being subject to the agreement, which sends them back to the U.S. You have written that you believe that the third country agreement is unconstitutional under Canadian law, and I assume that was pressed when it was first entered into 15 years ago. Can you briefly talk about the legal challenges to the agreement?
Yeah, so advocates for refugees brought a constitutional challenge to the agreement right when it came into effect. The argument was essentially that the United States has different asylum policies than Canada, that some people who might obtain refugee protection in Canada would not be eligible in the United States. One group that was often pointed to was women facing domestic violence who were able to get protection in Canada, but at the time it was very difficult to secure similar protection in the United States. And so the argument was the United States is not safe for at least some refugees. That argument was actually accepted by the lower courts. They found that the United States was not safe, and therefore that violated the refugee claimant's right to life, liberty, and security of the person, which is protected by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so the lower court struck down the agreement as unconstitutional. It then went up on appeal, and there was a very narrow technical reason why that decision was overturned, and the matter has never substantively returned to the courts. Advocates for refugees more recently, seeing the very large number of people who are trying to get from the United States to Canada since President Trump was elected, they've brought a new constitutional challenge, essentially making the same argument that was made before, that some people who would obtain refugee protection in Canada won't be protected in the United States, pointing to other policies, detention of children, separation of families, the recent announcement by Jeff Sessions that tightened the ability of women facing domestic violence to obtain refugee protection, essentially saying, even if the United States was safe previously, under the Trump administration, it's not, and therefore the agreement should be found to be unconstitutional. You add to that there's been a change to the very narrow technical legal question that led the appeal courts to reject the constitutional challenge. So it's now easier to bring a constitutional challenge in this context. My view is that it's pretty clear that at least for some asylum seekers, not for everyone, but at least for some asylum seekers, the U.S. is no longer safe for refugees.
Where is that case now in the Canadian courts?
The case is still at very early stages, so it's in the lower courts. There's going to be a hearing, I think, scheduled for January.
And I would think one of the policy arguments in favor of that position would be, without the agreement, you'll have fewer people trying to enter irregularly into Canada. They'll all just come to a port of entry and apply for asylum and be put into the Canadian asylum system. Yep.
Yeah. So that's one of the other constitutional arguments that's being made. So one argument is the U.S. is not safe for refugees. The other argument is under Canadian constitutional law, the government's not allowed to create policies that increase the harm that particular groups will experience for exercising a right that they're entitled to. So asylum seekers have the right to request refugee protection in Canada, and Canada has created barriers preventing them from doing that in a safe, regular way, that is, presenting themselves to a port of entry. And although most asylum seekers are coming to fairly easy to cross sites, just roads that are kind of divided in half by flower pots, for example. Other asylum seekers are crossing in more difficult sites. So there was a big news story last year in the winter about a couple of asylum seekers who crossed the border in the prairies during the winter. There was a big storm. They got lost. They had frostbite. One of them lost fingers. Another one lost a hand. So that the policy is encouraging irregular migration, but it's also encouraging asylum seekers to take risks, and that is problematic and potentially unconstitutional.
I would think that the Trump administration would be in favor of your lawsuit because they must see this as primarily meaning return of large numbers of people to the United States and very few to Canada, since the flow really doesn't go the other way, given the more favorable asylum system in Canada. Has there been any rumblings from the Trump administration on whether they'd like to rethink this agreement?
It's interesting because the rumblings are actually coming from the other direction. So the Canadian government has been pressed by the political party on the right, the Conservative Party. They've been pressed to try to expand the Safe Third Country Agreement. The concern is, well, why do we have this agreement to send people back to the United States if anyone can get around the agreement by, going 100 meters to the left of the official port of entry? Why don't we enter into a new agreement that would apply at the entire land border? So the Conservatives are saying the government should go off and renegotiate an expanded agreement. There were some initial efforts by the government to do that, and the United States was not responsive to that.
Which is not surprising.
Well, the U.S. government has little interest in certainly in expanding the agreement, but I would also have very little interest in keeping the agreement as is. The other place where this has played out is that the political party on the left, the New Democratic Party, has been asking the Canadian government to suspend or withdraw from the Safe Third Country Agreement, essentially on the grounds that the U.S. is no longer safe for refugees. And the response to that has been, well, hang on, Canada is in really delicate negotiations around NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, really important to the Canadian economy. We shouldn't do anything that could potentially upset the U.S. administration. The U.S. might not may not be particularly pleased to have the Canadian government say you're a country that doesn't respect international law, that's not safe for refugees. So we don't want to do anything that might rock the boat. The curious part of that argument is you would think that the current administration would actually be quite pleased just to get rid of the agreement and to have thousands of asylum seekers come to Canada and leave the United States. So it's hard to know. I mean, the current U.S. administration is such an unpredictable beast at the moment. It's hard to know what they're thinking on these questions. But it is something from as an observer from Canada looking kind of down, wondering, why doesn't the U.S. actually take the initiative here and suspend the agreement?
Yeah. So I think people in the United States would have trouble with the concept that the United States is not a safe third country for asylum seekers. There is a well-functioning asylum system. People can make their claims. There are several levels of judicial review. It may be that Canada has a standard that makes it easier to get asylum, but that doesn't mean that the U.S., even if has a slightly tighter standard, is violating international law or is not a safe place for an asylum seeker. So what are you really claiming when you say the U.S. is not a safe third country? Yeah.
So I think the U.S. is safe for large groups of people. I mean, the U.S. is one of the most important constitutional democracies in the world. It has one of the most highly respected judiciaries in the world. It has been a leader in various aspects of international refugee law, resettles until recently, a leader in refugee resettlement. So it's understandable that people might look with some skepticism on the claim that the United States is not safe. I think, though, that it's important to understand that this is actually a fairly narrow claim. The claim is not that the US is unsafe in general. The claim is merely that some people who would obtain refugee protection in Canada would not obtain similar protection in the United States. And the best example is under the changes announced by the current administration relating to the refugee definition, and specifically people facing gender-based violence and people facing gang violence will no longer obtain refugee protection, or at least it will be it'll be much more difficult to obtain refugee protection. Those are two groups that would, as a matter of course, if they could substantiate their claims about the risks that they face, they would obtain refugee protection in Canada. So they're people who meet Canada's refugee definition, but who would likely not obtain protection in the United States. So the question from Canada is, if Canada can't deport those folks directly to their home country to face what Canada views as persecution in violation of the Refugee Convention, can we do it indirectly by sending people back to the United States? Then if you add to that some of the other features of American immigration practices at the moment, things like detention of children, separation of families, the argument then is not just that particular people won't obtain refugee protection, but that they will not have access to the same kind of rights that they might have in Canada. So the argument is fairly narrow, and it's restricted to the idea of not is the U.S. safe for all asylum seekers, but is the U.S. safe for this particular asylum seeker.
I thought some of the Haitian asylum seekers who had come to Canada, in fact, were detained or put into some kind of custodial arrangement. Is that not accurate?
Yes. So Canada does have immigration detention. We only detain children as a measure of last resort. There are very few children who are detained. The main difference, though, is that Canada does not detain asylum seekers in order to deter other asylum seekers from coming to the country. And that's exactly what the current U.S. administration announced they were doing with the zero tolerance policy. They're trying to impose penalties on asylum seekers in order to discourage further asylum seeking. From a Canadian perspective, and I think from an international law perspective, that really shifts the nature of the detention from a kind of administrative practice into a penalty. And as you know, the Refugee Convention prohibits states from imposing penalties on asylum seekers for irregular arrival. So I do think that there's been a difference under the current administration, even though people have always been detained, and even though children have been separated for quite some time. The scope of the practice has changed, but also the purpose of the practice has changed.
So let me take you to the southern border of the United States rather than the southern border of Canada. The United States has indicated an interest in entering into a third country agreement with Mexico, which of course would work to the advantage of the United States in the same way the Canadian agreement was seen as working to the advantage of the Canadian system. And currently, there's a fair degree of evidence that people arriving at a port of entry at the southwest border are basically told to wait in Mexico in order to file their asylum claim until the system can handle the numbers that are coming forward. I wonder if you have thoughts on the legality or the wisdom of the policies at the southwest border of the United States.
Yeah, well, I do think that one of the reasons that the United States might not have already tried to withdraw from the Canada-U.S. Safe Third Country Agreement is that they might want to use that as a template for a similar agreement with Mexico, and the numbers would be quite dramatic if the number of asylum seekers coming from Mexico to the United States, if that flow just stopped or was largely reduced, it would have a much bigger impact than the blockage on the Canadian border. It doesn't surprise me that that the United States is interested in pursuing that possibility. I think that's reflective of a broader trend of developed countries around the world trying to prevent the arrival of asylum seekers using various deflection practices, essentially trying to contain asylum seekers in the regions that in their home regions. So none of this is surprising. I do think it puts the entire international refugee regime at risk, because if Mexico, if Canada does this, and so the United States does this, and then Mexico does this, and then you keep on deflecting people until people can't even get out of their own country at all. And so,
well, and it argues for creating safe zones in those countries, doesn't it, where people can move with safety and not have to flee to another country?
yeah, if that was a politically viable, option, I mean, the other possibility is to work on that and at the same time try to dismantle these deflection practices.
Yeah. So let me end with this question for you, Sean. So what lessons do we draw from this? Someone can hear all this information and say, well, odd agreement, why'd the United States ever enter into it? But it doesn't really matter because the refugees, the asylum seekers, have found a way around it and into Canada, and they're likely to be protected or better protected in Canada. On the other hand, with the tightening of the U.S. system, there does seem to be a greater disparity between Canada and the U.S. And how do we create a global system of refugee protection that basically is based on the same standards of who qualifies for status and the like? How would you put this into a broader picture?
Yeah, well, I think one of the lessons of all of this is that when countries enter into these kinds of arrangements, whether it's Canada and the United States or the European Union, when you enter into those kinds of arrangements, you effectively are integrating your refugee policies with another country. The logic behind the agreements is that all of the countries that are party to those agreements are, in fact, safe for refugees. And the challenge is that when you do that in a context where countries are sovereign, where there are significant shifts in immigration policy, in refugee policy, it effectively implicates both countries or all the countries in each other's refugee practices. So Canada, for example, has distinguished itself rhetorically from the United States on the refugee file. At the same time as President Trump was announcing travel bans, the Prime Minister of Canada was writing these beautiful tweets about Canada being welcoming to refugees, that Canada valuing religious and other forms of diversity. So there's a rhetorical strategy of distinguishing Canadian immigration practices from U.S. immigration practices. But what the Safe Third Country Agreement does is it implicates Canada in U.S. Refugee practices. Because if Canada is prepared to send people who come to the border and seek refugee protection in Canada, if Canada is prepared to send them back to the United States, Canada is knowing full well that in the United States they may well be deported to their home country. Canada's participating in that form of removal. So to put the matter simply, I think we've got a Canadian Prime Minister who talks about being welcoming to refugees, who calls himself a feminist, who's done has gotten a lot of credit for work on confronting domestic violence. Who then is prepared to continue to send women facing domestic violence back to the United States, where they won't be protected and will they be deported. You're being implicated in the U.S. Refugee policies. And so the question is, how do you, if you want to maintain the ability to have separate immigration and refugee practices, if you want to be able to stand up and say, no, when we think about refugees, we don't just mean, Soviet dissidents. We also mean women facing domestic violence. We also mean LGBT folks who are being mistreated. That this reflects our identity and who we think is deserving of protecting. If you want to be able to say that, it's hard to enter into these agreements that tie you to the practices in another country that may change and may not reflect those values.
Sean, thanks so much. Really interesting. And I think for us folks south of the border, we've learned an awful lot about the Canadian practice and the way that interacts with what's going on in this country. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Tempest Tossed, a production of the Zolberg Institute on Migration and Mobility at the New School. Technical assistance is provided by Sohail Ansari at Dodge 112. Our themes were composed by Eli Alenikoff. We would welcome your comments and suggestions for future episodes. You can reach us at tossedtempest@gmail.com. That is tossedtempest, all one word, @gmail.com.